The Victorian era just might be one of the most well-loved time periods in history. It certainly receives a lot of attention in the media, often to the point where it can be heavily romanticized. But as someone who loves to learn about the 1800s, who finds great fascination in all of their fashion, inventions, and social culture, I have to wrestle with the fact that I likely wouldn't survive if I was born then. And you probably wouldn't either. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Historidame, and today, we're learning all about why you wouldn't survive the Victorian era. The effects of the Industrial Revolution were in full swing by the time of Queen Victoria's reign, and it spurred a mass migration of people into cities in search of jobs and new opportunities. Many of these people ended up working in industries that were in high demand, like textile production, mills, and iron making, resulting in much of the working-class population finding employment in factories. Now, not only did these factory jobs barely pay enough to survive on, but the hours were brutal, and there was very little in the way of worker protections, so conditions were downright dangerous, sometimes even deadly. Factory shifts were 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, usually with a half-hour break for breakfast and another for dinner. And I'm saying usually because in many cases workers were expected to clean their machinery during their meal breaks, which would sometimes take up to half of it. On top of all that, they could also be expected to put in extra hours during particularly busy times of the year. And if there was ever an incident that caused a cease in production, like broken machinery or a holiday, they would have to make up that time later. But the average factory worker had more to worry about than just exhausting work hours. They had to make it through that 12-hour shift in a sweltering, poorly ventilated factory, surrounded by moving machinery that had no guards or safety protections. Corruption was rife in manufacturing, and the rich people at the top didn't care about who they stepped on to get there. In fact, it was rather common for factory owners to completely disregard worker safety because it saved them money. Day and night shifts saw that production never stopped, so the machines were constantly running, even during maintenance. Because of this, and the fact that machines were already dangerous due to not having any guards or protections, accidents were common, and workers frequently sustained serious injuries, like the loss of fingers, hands, or even entire limbs. Others weren't even that lucky, and lost their lives. There were also no protections when it came to workers that were regularly exposed to toxic materials or dangerous environments. Those who worked in factories that produced matches, for example, faced a horrifying condition known as phossy jaw, in which exposure to white phosphorus caused necrosis in the person's teeth and jawbones. But the sheer amount of profit that was made from operating factories this way made it so that there was actually more financial incentive to ignore existing safety laws entirely, since it was cheaper to cut costs or just pay the government fine than it was to pause production or adjust the factories for worker safety. Children were also commonly employed in these places, and would have to face the same conditions or even worse, since certain jobs involved them crawling into the operating machinery to clean things or prevent blockages. They were also paid less than adults were, which made greedy factory owners only want to hire more of them. These children were not only very young, but were also exhausted, malnourished, and often sleep-deprived, and it was not uncommon for factory managers to use physical violence to punish them if mistakes were made. It is not an exaggeration to say that working a factory job during the Victorian era was downright terrifying. But if you somehow managed to survive that, there were plenty of other things in your daily life that could potentially cause the end of it. We often have this image about life in times past when it comes to food. A loving wife serving hearty, home-cooked meals to her family. Things like pies, stews, and homemade bread tend to show up a lot. None of this unhealthy junk food from our modern times that's packed full of preservatives and unnatural food colorings. But this ideal image is far from reality, because while we have our monosodium glutamate and high-fructose corn syrup, the Victorians had plenty of other things that definitely shouldn't have been put into food. Not much was known about nutrition during the 1800s. The average Victorian did not eat a balanced diet, especially if they were working class, and many of the poor were malnourished or deficient in important vitamins like vitamin C and vitamin D. Staple foods included things like tea, potatoes, onions, apples, cheese, and of course bread. Those who were farmers had more options when it came to produce, but the poor who lived in cities usually had to survive primarily on bread and tea. The average level of public nutrition was made even worse, however, by something known as food adulteration. This is the process of secretly adding cheaper ingredients to a food product in order to cut costs or alter its appearance, and it was basically unavoidable in the 1800s. Everything from coffee to bread to mustard was added to, and this affected people of all classes, since it was not only done to cheap staples like bread, but also to luxury goods. Now, these additives were sometimes harmless, like adding a blend of both coffee beans and other types of legumes to ground coffee products, but others were straight up inedible or even dangerous. Bread, in particular, which remember was most people's main food, was almost always diluted with things like chalk, plaster, ground up bones, and alum, which were definitely not things that you should be eating. This was done so that bakers could cut costs and stretch their flour supplies further, and additives like these could make bread bulkier, denser, and whiter looking. As you might expect, however, eating things like plaster and alum did not go so well. They could easily cause digestive problems like constipation or chronic diarrhea, which could be deadly. Other additives that were commonly used in food were substances that were made from dangerous chemicals or metals, like copper sulfate, which was used to make preserved vegetables appear greener, or Venetian lead, which was a common filler in sugar. To make matters even worse, food sellers were practically incentivized to continue adulterating their products. The population in urban areas was growing like crazy, and stretching the resources that you had meant that more people could be fed with less. And if you chose not to adulterate your products, you would likely go out of business from being undercut by the competition who did. Obviously, when things like these are added to almost every food that you eat, it is very easy to develop chronic health problems, or a particularly bad case of food poisoning that does you in. And if the food additives don't get you, the malnutrition will probably invite something else that will. While the Industrial Revolution may have spurred a new age of innovation and prosperity, it also came with unforeseen consequences. The rapid population growth of Britain during the 19th century, combined with the fact that many people moved to cities in order to find work, resulted in a large number of the country's people living in densely populated urban areas. Unfortunately, cities at the time didn't have the infrastructure needed to support so many people living in one place. Indoor plumbing wasn't really around yet, and sewage systems relied heavily on natural bodies of water, like the River Thames that ran through London. This resulted in the local water supply being heavily contaminated with things like sewage, waste from factories, and pretty much anything else that people felt like chucking in there. It also made the perfect breeding ground for a myriad of diseases. The Victorian era saw numerous epidemics ravage urban populations, and no one was safe, not the rich and certainly not the poor. One popular disease that was making its rounds in London was typhus fever, which is a bacterial infection spread by lice that results in serious flu-like symptoms. One of its largest epidemics happened between 1846 and 1849, and is estimated to have killed around 30,000 people throughout England and Wales. Another disease that was rampant is the similarly named typhoid fever, which was spread through drinking water that was contaminated with feces. It is also the disease that famously killed Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Consort Albert, so not even the royal family was safe. Other illnesses that were sweeping the nation included scarlet fever, tuberculosis, measles, dysentery, croup, smallpox, and many more. So even if you managed to survive one of them, it is likely that another one would hit you at some point during your lifetime. But above all, the epidemic that really hit London hard was cholera. There were 4 outbreaks of cholera during Britain's history, and the largest of them happened in 1848, killing tens of thousands of people. Now, cholera had a 40 to 60% mortality rate, so it was really not something that you wanted to catch. Like typhoid fever, it was spread through contaminated drinking water, which, as we have established, was pretty much all the water. And to make matters worse, many people were also malnourished, so the illness hit them even harder. The main issue with these kinds of diseases is that during the Victorian era there was not yet a good understanding of how they spread. Despite many European doctors conducting investigations, people were still clinging to the miasma theory, where they thought that bad smells were the cause. It wasn't until London's entire sewage system was reworked after the summer of 1858 that such epidemics became less frequent. But even if you managed to dodge all of the diseases that were going around your city, you survived working a deadly factory job and eating contaminated food, the Victorian era still had more dangers for you to worry about, and some of them were in your very own home. With so many factories producing new products, the average consumer had more options than ever when it came to buying things for the home. Unfortunately, many of these new products also contained dangerous substances that were slowly poisoning the population at a widespread scale. Lead, for example, was used in children's toys since it was a fantastic preserver of wood and was a major ingredient in a lot of colored paints. Lead is very well known to be dangerous, and it even was during the 1800s. The only issue is that the Victorians didn't understand it could be transferred from the toy into the child's body, if they did something like put it in their mouth. And to top it all off, lead actually has a slight sweet taste, so it only provided more incentive for small children to do just that. Ingesting lead can damage the body's nervous system, and can cause issues like headaches, mood swings, memory problems, and infertility. Unfortunately, many of these symptoms are difficult to identify, and a lot of the clearer signs of lead poisoning, like dark lines around the gums and base of the teeth, did not appear until the damage was already done. Arsenic was another poison that was common in the Victorian home. Bright arsenic-based pigments were very popular for things like clothes, furnishing, and wallpaper, especially in colors like the infamous Scheele's green. Wallpaper in particular was the cause for a lot of poisoning cases, and even death. In damp conditions, arsenic-based wallpaper can emit a toxic gas, and in drier ones it creates tiny flakes of arsenic that spread into the air, which were later breathed in by unsuspecting families. There were cases of children in green bedrooms falling ill with seemingly no cause, or in more grisly cases, dropping dead after licking the candy-colored wallpaper. Depending on what products you chose to buy, poison could seep into your life from every angle. There was arsenic in clothing, makeup, books, candles, even tiny amounts in food coloring. And being in such a toxic environment for a prolonged period of time could have serious consequences on one's health, provided it didn't kill you first. So, do you think you would survive the Victorian era? Hey everyone, thank you for watching! Let me know if you think you would have survived the 1800s down in the comments. I probably would have died from something like strep throat at the age of 3. If you want to see more content like this, you can also subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on all the fun history videos of the future. But for now, I bid you farewell.